The growing tensions between President Putin and President Trump over the Ukraine war are creating significant challenges for peace negotiations. While both leaders have shown interest in resolving the conflict, their differing perspectives on NATO and territorial issues are complicating efforts to reach a lasting agreement.
Welcome back, everyone, to the Deep Dive. This time, we're going deep into the Ukraine war. We'll be exploring the potential for a resolution now that Donald Trump is back in the White House.
Back in the Oval Office, yeah.
We've got a ton of sources for this one, news articles, expert commentary. We even have some direct quotes from Putin and Zelenskyy themselves.
To be interesting.
So what's the mission for this deep dive?
Wow.
I think we want to give our listeners the key facts, obviously, and lay out the different perspectives, the potential scenarios. I mean, this is a really high-stakes situation, wouldn't you say?
Oh, absolutely. This is geopolitics at its most intense, I'd say. On one level, you have these two figures, Putin and Trump. Both of them say they want to end this war quickly.
Right, ended quickly.
But, when you dig a little deeper, you start to see that their visions of what peace even means could be wildly different.
Okay, so let's remind everyone where we stand. It's January 2025.
Right.
The war has been raging for over 2 years now.
A long time.
And as you said, we're getting some really mixed signals from all sides.
Yeah, and Putin, for example, he's said publicly that Russia is ready to compromise.
Okay, compromise.
Yeah.
But there's a catch, right?
Oh, there's a huge caveat. He says any agreement has to be based on the realities on the ground. And this is where the conflict with Trump's vision might really start to emerge.
Okay, so that's the key phrase, realities on the ground. What does that actually mean for our listener who might not be, following this day to day?
Well, Putin's talking about the military situation as it stands right now. Remember, Russia occupies a big chunk of Ukraine.
Including Crimea.
Crimea, parts of the east. And so this compromise he's offering, it basically means Ukraine has to just accept these territorial losses, give up on joining NATO, and let Russia have its way really in the region.
So Putin's basically saying, here are my terms, take it or leave it.
Yeah, it's a pretty hard bargain.
Definitely not what many in the West would consider a just peace.
No, not at all. And this is where Trump's big promise to end this war quickly, even that 24-hour claim he made.
During the campaign.
Yeah, during the campaign. This is where it becomes really interesting. Can he pull that off without just giving in to Putin? Big question.
Then there's Zelenskyy, right smack in the middle of all this. He even admitted to having a complicated history with Trump.
I mean, who could forget that first impeachment?
Right, exactly. But at the same time, he seems kind of hopeful about Trump's potential role.
Yeah.
Cautiously optimistic, maybe?
Yeah, it's a gamble, that's for sure. He's banking on Trump's deal-making image, I guess. He even talked about Trump's strength and unpredictability.
Strength and unpredictability. Yeah, that's definitely one way to describe how Trump handles foreign policy.
For sure. And that unpredictability is making a lot of folks nervous. Some worry he'll make impulsive decisions that just escalate everything.
Right.
But then others think, well, maybe that's what we need. Maybe that's what it'll take to break this deadlock.
So let's get into the specifics. What are some of the actual paths Trump could take? What would those paths mean for Putin, Zelenskyy, for Ukraine's future?
All right. Well, one option is to push for a ceasefire immediately. Get the guns to go silent. This might appeal to Trump because he wants a quick win.
Sure, a quick victory.
But that carries risks, of course.
Well, yeah, I mean, a ceasefire wouldn't actually solve anything, would it?
No, you're right. It could just freeze the conflict where it is. Russia keeps the land they've taken and the underlying problems.
Just fester.
Just fester, exactly.
So, not a great option long term. What about a more negotiation-focused approach? Trump's supposed to be this master deal maker, right?
That's the image, yeah. And he could try to leverage that, try to broker some kind of grand bargain.
Okay, grand bargain. But how realistic is that, really, given what Putin's already said?
Well, that's the issue. It's hard to see Ukraine agreeing to a deal that involves giving up so much land,
Right.
diminishing their role on the world stage.
So you almost have this, clash of egos brewing. Two big personalities used to getting what they want.
Oh, potentially. And this is where it gets fascinating. You have to go beyond just the policies themselves.
Yeah.
And look at the psychology of these two guys. What makes them tick? How do they react under pressure?
Almost like a high-stakes poker game, but with the fate of millions at stake.
Exactly. And understanding the players is just as crucial as knowing what cards they're holding.
So we have the ceasefire, which might not actually solve anything. and negotiations, which could be tough given how far apart they are. What other options are there?
Well, there's the arm Ukraine to the teeth option. Some of Trump's advisors have been pushing for this.
Okay, arm Ukraine, meaning give them even more weapons, more military support.
Exactly. Potentially, more advanced weapons than they have now. The idea is to tip the balance of power back in their favor.
But wouldn't that risk making the whole thing much, much worse?
Oh, it's definitely a risk. I mean, it could provoke Putin, maybe even pull NATO into a direct fight with Russia. That's the big fear.
A proxy war between the U.S. and Russia, but fought in Ukraine.
A scary thought, and one that a lot of experts are deeply worried about. It's a very volatile situation, One wrong move, and things could spiral out of control.
And then there's Trump himself, sending these mixed signals. During the campaign, he was often pretty friendly towards Putin.
Yeah, there was a lot of that.
But then he goes and picks Keith Kellogg as his special envoy to Ukraine.
Yeah, that was interesting.
Kellogg, a retired general, has said he supports arming Ukraine if Russia won't negotiate. So which is it?
That's the million-dollar question, right? The Putin-friendly Trump or the one who's ready to give Ukraine all the firepower they need?
And how does all of this fit into this potential clash with Putin we've been talking about?
Well, that's what everyone's trying to figure out. Zelenskyy, the whole world is watching. And remember, even with all this talk of envoys and deals, the war is still escalating.
You're talking about the bombardments on December 31st, right?
Exactly. Both sides launched major attacks. Russia hit Ukrainian cities. Ukraine hit back with missiles deep into Russia. It was a grim way to end the year.
And it gets back to Putin's realities on the ground, doesn't it? He seems determined to get what he wants by force, even as he talks about compromise.
That's the potential for conflict right there. If Trump tries to push back against those realities...
By arming Ukraine.
Yeah, by arming Ukraine or taking a hard line, it could lead to a real clash with Putin. Not just words, maybe even military action.
So how does Kellogg fit into this then? Does his appointment tell us anything about what Trump might actually do?
It's hard to say for sure, but Kellogg's not known for backing down, so it might be a sign that Trump's willing to be tougher than some people expected.
So where does that leave Zelenskyy and the Ukrainian people?
In a tough spot, to put it mildly, caught between these two powerful figures, each with their own plans.
And they're the ones bearing the brunt of it all.
Absolutely. Facing the violence, the displacement, the uncertainty every single day. Their future hinges on these decisions that they have very little control over.
Makes you think about the toll this must be taking on Zelenskyy. Leading a country at war, trying to navigate this diplomatic minefield.
And he's dealing with Putin, who's a master at manipulation and intimidation.
Yeah, that's a whole other level of pressure. We'll have to delve into that more in the next part of our deep dive.
Definitely. There's a lot more to unpack here. Yeah, it's easy to get caught up in all the politics, the power plays. But we can't forget, there are real people at the heart of this.
Millions of them.
Millions. Their lives have been turned upside down. It's a humanitarian crisis. Displacement, the economy, not to mention the constant threat of,
the violence.
Of violence, exactly. And they're caught in the middle. Their future depends on what these powerful figures decide.
It's got to be weighing on Zelenskyy, right?
Yeah.
I mean, not just leading a country at war,
right,
but trying to deal with all these, diplomatic tightropes.
Oh, absolutely. Every move he makes, every word he says. People are analyzing it, looking for any sign of weakness.
Or concession.
Or concession, yeah. And on top of that, he's up against Putin.
Who's a master at, psychological warfare?
Oh, Putin's been playing that game for years, projecting this image of strength, of control. He's very calculated, very strategic. He thinks long-term.
But hasn't he also miscalculated, at least in this war? I mean, I've read that he underestimated how much the Ukrainians would fight back.
Yeah, and how much support they'd get from the West.
Right, exactly.
A lot of people think Putin expected a quick win, thought Ukraine would just collapse and that the West would be divided. Clearly, none of that happened.
So does that create an opening for Trump? Could he use this miscalculation to get a good deal, something that helps Ukraine and also keeps Russia in check?
That's the hopeful scenario. But it'd take a deep understanding of Putin. Trump would have to be willing to play hardball, can't show any weakness.
Because Putin will exploit it.
Absolutely. He'll seize on it.
But how do you play hardball with someone like Putin and not risk, making things even worse?
That's the dilemma. It's a delicate balance. One idea is to offer a mix of incentives and deterrence. Maybe ease some of the sanctions in exchange for a real ceasefire or withdrawal of Russian troops.
So that's the carrot. What's the stick?
Trump would have to make it absolutely clear. that any more aggression from Russia would have serious consequences. More military support for Ukraine, maybe a stronger NATO presence in Eastern Europe.
High risk, high reward kind of thing.
Yeah, exactly. But can Trump pull it off? With his personality, his history of impulsive moves, that's the big unknown.
And then there's the whole domestic situation in the U.S., right?
Oh, that's crucial. How much appetite is there for a long-term commitment to this conflict?
The war's been going on for years now.
People get tired of war. You get war fatigue in the public, even within the government.
And Congress controls the money.
Right. They have the power to say yes or no to any big military or economic commitments.
We've been talking a lot about the U.S. and Russia, but what about the rest of the world? How are other leaders reacting to Trump being back and his, let's say, unique approach to Ukraine?
It's a mixed bag, honestly. Some European leaders, especially those closer to Russia, they're nervous, which is understandable. They remember what happened during Trump's first term.
Helsinki comes to mind.
Helsinki, exactly. That didn't exactly reassure America's allies.
And then there's that whole America First idea.
Right. Makes them worry that Trump will just go isolationist, leave them to deal with Russia on their own.
But I've also read that some leaders think Trump's unpredictability could actually be helpful.
Yeah, there's that argument, the idea that traditional diplomacy hasn't worked with Putin, so maybe you need someone who, shakes things up a bit.
Someone who can throw Putin off balance.
Exactly. It's a gamble, no doubt, but the stakes are so high that some are willing to roll the dice.
And remember, this isn't just about Ukraine, is it?
No, this is about the whole global order, the balance of power, the rules that have been in place since the Cold War ended.
So we have these external pressures, the international scene. But what about internally? Within Russia, within Ukraine?
Oh, those dynamics are crucial too. It's not just about Putin and Trump. It's about the forces at play in their own countries.
What kind of forces? Public opinion.
Public opinion, the economy, political factions. Take Russia, for example. A lot of people there are starting to feel uneasy about this war.
Uneasy about the cost.
The costs, yeah. The lives lost, the economic hit. Putin's got a tight grip on the narrative.
Right.
But cracks are starting to show.
So even though he acts tough, Putin might be feeling the pressure back home.
It's possible. The sanctions are hurting, and the war has exposed weaknesses in their economy. Plus, thousands of Russian soldiers have died.
So all that internal pressure plus what the West is doing, could it force Putin to back down a bit?
It's something to consider, definitely. But Putin's a tough guy. He doesn't give up easily.
What about Ukraine? How are people feeling there? Are they hopeful about a peaceful resolution, or are they bracing for a long fight?
The Ukrainians have been incredible, so resilient, so determined in the face of everything. But they're also tired. They want peace.
But peace on what terms? Would they be willing to accept Putin's realities, give up land to stop the fighting?
That's a question for the Ukrainian people. And it's not that simple. There are different opinions. Some want to negotiate. Some say fight to the end. It's a divided country.
So much to think about. Divisions within Ukraine, a complex global situation, and two leaders who are, well, let's just say, unpredictable.
Yeah, it's a lot to process, and it shows how important it is to really dig deep. Go beyond the simple stories you hear on the news.
Understand the history, the economics, all the different factors driving this conflict.
Exactly. And realize that there aren't any easy solutions here.
As we head into this next phase, with Trump back in charge, things are still very fluid. The potential for conflict between him and Putin is real, but so is the possibility of some kind of resolution. And whatever happens, it'll have a ripple effect far beyond Ukraine.
And we have to remember the human cost. This isn't just about politics, it's about people's lives. The families torn apart, the generation growing up with this war as their backdrop.
Yeah, that's the real tragedy here. We'll be right back with the final part of our deep dive into the Ukraine crisis. Feels like we're at this, this inflection point. Putin's not budging, Trump's a wild card, and the war just keeps going. What should our listeners be watching for, in the next few weeks or months that might give us some hints about how this whole thing might unfold?
I think the thing to really pay attention to is how Trump handles Putin. How does he approach that relationship?
Will he try to, buddy up to Putin again, like he seemed to do in his first term?
Yeah, that's one possibility. But he could also go the other way, take a much tougher stance.
And wouldn't that be a problem for him back home? I mean, a lot of Americans are really wary of Russia.
Absolutely. Trump's got to be careful. He needs to look strong, like he's not going to back down to Russia. but he can't alienate the part of his base that actually kind of likes Putin.
Yeah, it's a tough balancing act.
Oh, for sure.
Another thing I'm wondering about is the support for Ukraine from the rest of the world.
From the West, yeah.
Will the EU, will NATO keep sending money and weapons at the same level? Or will they start to get, I don't know, donor fatigue?
That's a real concern. Wars are expensive. The longer this drags on, the harder it'll be to keep that coalition together.
And we talked about the pressures within Russia and Ukraine.
Right.
Could those change the game somehow? Maybe force a negotiation or, I guess, even make things worse?
They could, definitely. Inside Russia, those sanctions are having an effect. There's grumbling among the elites. And if the war keeps costing them money and lives, Putin might face some real pushback, even from his own people.
So he might be weaker than he appears.
It's possible, yeah.
And what about Ukraine? At what point do they have to, consider giving in a little?
That's the awful dilemma Zelensky's facing. He needs to show strength, but he also has to be realistic. Ukraine can only hold out for so long. The longer this goes on, the more territory they lose, and the harder it'll be to rebuild.
So what's the answer? I mean, we've got all these moving parts, these huge personalities. It feels almost impossible to predict what'll happen.
That's the truth of it. Geopolitics is messy. You've got these powerful people making decisions that affect millions, and there are no easy answers.
So for our listeners who are trying to make sense of all this, what would you say if you were advising Trump? What would you tell him to do? How should he handle this whole situation?
That's the million-dollar question, right? The one everyone's trying to answer. And honestly, there's no magic formula. But I think any successful approach has to have a few key elements.
Like what? Give us some takeaways.
First, you got to understand Putin. What does he want? What are his goals? Trump can't go into this thinking he can charm Putin or reason with him.
No more of that. I can get along with anyone's stuff.
Yeah, that'd be a mistake. Putin's a competitor, a rival. Treat him like one.
Make sense?
What else?
Second, Trump needs the West on his side. A strong, united front. Putin takes advantage of division. So Trump has to work with the EU, with NATO, show Putin that they're all in this together.
But can he do that? After how he treated those allies in his first term?
It'll be tough. He has to convince them that he's serious about this, that he'll put their interests ahead of his own.
Big ask.
Yeah, no doubt. And then there's Ukraine itself. They can't just be passive in all this.
They have to have agency.
Exactly. They need to show that they're strong, that they're willing to fight for their future. They have to make it clear to Russia and to the West that they're a nation, not just a bargaining chip.
So this deep dive has been, well, it's been a real deep dive. We've looked at the potential clash between Putin and Trump, at all the different paths this could take. And we can't forget, this is a real war with real consequences.
And I hope we've given our listeners a better understanding of what's at stake here. It's complicated, it's uncertain, and it matters. We always say keep the conversation going in the comments. Share your thoughts, your ideas, your hopes for Ukraine.
Because this is something we all need to pay attention to. What happens in Ukraine affects all of us. The choices these leaders make, they have consequences for the whole world.
Well said. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and stay engaged.
As the conflict continues, the path to peace remains uncertain. While diplomatic efforts persist, the deep divisions between Putin and Trump, coupled with ongoing military actions, make a swift resolution unlikely. The world watches as these tensions unfold, hoping for a breakthrough that can end the devastating war.